In the winter of 1855, the entire Kellerman family, Heinrich, his wife Martha, and their 4 children, disappeared without a trace from their coal mine in the Kentucky Highlands. The official report claimed a catastrophic mine collapse had buried them all. Yet, no bodies were ever recovered. For over 3 decades, the people of Harlan County accepted this tragic explanation until a dying man's confession in 1889 revealed a conspiracy so shocking it would expose the dark birth of corporate America's most ruthless practices. What really happened to the Kellermans wasn't an accident. It was cold-blooded murder disguised as industrial tragedy, orchestrated by men who valued coal more than human life. Before we continue with the story of the Kellerman family and their doomed discovery in the Kentucky mountains, if you're fascinated by hidden chapters of American history like this one, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell. We uncover these forgotten mysteries every week, and tell us in the comments what state are you listening from. We love hearing from viewers across the country who share our passion for America's darkest secrets. The truth about what befell the Kellermans begins not with their disappearance, but with their remarkable discovery just months before. A discovery that would seal their fate and expose the ruthless appetite of America's emerging industrial giants. The Kentucky Highlands of 1855 were a world apart from the bustling cities of the East. Nestled in the Appalachian Mountains, small communities like Pine Ridge existed in relative isolation, where families carved out modest livings from the unforgiving terrain. The region's economy had long depended on subsistence farming and small-scale logging, but whispers of coal beneath the mountains were beginning to change everything. Heinrich Kellerman had arrived in Kentucky 7 years earlier, part of the wave of German immigrants seeking opportunity in America's expanding frontier. Unlike many of his countrymen who settled in cities, Heinrich was drawn to the mountains, where his knowledge of mining, learned in the coal fields of the Ruhr Valley, might prove valuable. He purchased 43 acres of seemingly worthless rocky hillside for the modest sum of $87, much to the amusement of local residents who considered the land too poor even for grazing. Heinrich's wife Martha, a sturdy woman with calloused hands and intelligent brown eyes, had supported their move with characteristic determination. Their children, Johann, 16, Maria, 14, young Wilhelm, 11, and baby Elisabeth, barely 3, had adapted to mountain life with the resilience of youth. The family spoke German at home, but English in town, straddling 2 worlds as they worked to establish themselves in their adopted country. By the autumn of 1854, Heinrich had begun preliminary excavations on his property, following veins of coal that seemed to run deeper and richer than anything he had encountered in Germany. Word of his early success spread quickly through Pine Ridge, and soon neighbors were speaking in hushed tones about the Kellerman luck. But it was in February of 1855 that Heinrich made a discovery that would change everything and ultimately destroy his family. In the hushed solitude of the pre-dawn hours, Heinrich breached a fissure that opened into what appeared to be a vast, naturally formed cavern. The sight arrested his breath. Before him lay the most immense and pristine seam of coal he had ever encountered, plunging into the mountain depths far beyond the reach of his lamp's glow. Even the most conservative appraisals suggested that the deposit contained sufficient high-grade coal to satiate Louisville's burgeoning industrial appetite for decades. Heinrich Kellerman, the German émigré who had once been derided for purchasing seemingly barren land, had fortuitously uncovered a treasure later appraised at over $200,000, a windfall destined to elevate him among Kentucky's elite. Word of this extraordinary find swept into Louisville within a week, borne by a traveling merchant who had witnessed wagonloads of uncommonly fine coal departing from Kellerman's property. Within the marble-pillared offices of the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company, this intelligence was received with both avid fascination and a simmering disquiet. Jeremiah Whitlock, the company's calculating managing director, had spent 2 years consolidating mineral rights across Harlan County by means of legal chicanery, political coercion, and, when expedient, outright intimidation. His design was but one fragment of a grander scheme to monopolize Kentucky's coal reserves at a time when the nation's hunger for fuel verged on the insatiable. The railroad boom, the expansion of manufacturing, and America's accelerating industrial ascendancy had rendered coal the new gold, and men of Beatlock's ilk intended to command every ton. Yet the Kellerman parcel represented a conspicuous void in his dominion. Geological surveys had marked the terrain as promising, but Heinrich's immigrant status and modest acreage had rendered him inconsequential, until now. The revelation that the richest vein in the region might lie beneath his feet imperiled Beatlock's meticulous plans and threatened to deprive the company of millions in prospective revenue. On March 15, 1855, Whitlock dispatched his most trusted operative, a cold-eyed enforcer named Samuel Briggs, to negotiate a purchase. Briggs arrived in Pine Ridge with what he deemed an irresistible proposition, $1,500 for the property, nearly 20-fold what Heinrich had originally paid. To Briggs, it was an effortless coup over a naive German farmer. Heinrich's reply, however, was courteous yet immovable. He expressed gratitude but declared his unwavering intent to retain the mine, which he viewed as the cornerstone of his family's American future, a patrimony to be bequeathed to generations unborn. Furthermore, Heinrich's own calculations had convinced him that the coil's value might exceed $75,000, eclipsing Briggs' offer many times over. Briggs' proposal rose to $3,000, then $5,000, his composure eroding with each refusal. When Heinrich's defiance endured, Briggs' tone transmuted from persuasion to veiled menace, speaking darkly of the perils of mining and the hazards that befell the unprotected. He reminded Heinrich of his property's isolation and hinted at how swiftly calamity could visit those without powerful allies. Having long ago learned in Germany to recognize threats cloaked as counsel, Heinrich expelled Briggs from his land. As the agent withdrew, he cast a final barb over his shoulder, "Consider your choice carefully, immerse German. These Kentucky mountains can be perilous for those who forget their place." That evening, Heinrich gathered his family at their modest supper table, speaking in German with a gravity that chilled the room. In Briggs' eyes, he had discerned the same glacial indifference he had once seen in the industrial magnates of the Old World, men who regarded laborers as expendable implements. Martha listened silently, her features tightening with unease as her husband recounted the encounter and voiced his deepening suspicion that their discovery had made them a target. In the weeks that followed, an escalating campaign of intimidation unfolded. Their mail service first faltered, then ceased entirely. Local merchants, once cordial, became distant, their willingness to extend credit evaporating. More ominously, Heinrich began to spot unfamiliar figures watching from the surrounding hills, disappearing whenever approached. In Louisville, Whitlock was deploying a tried-and-true stratagem for breaking recalcitrant landowners, economic constriction. Leveraging the company's influence with banks, suppliers, and officials, the Kellermans were financially quarantined. This was followed by illegal harassment, frivolous claims contesting Heinrich's purchase, draining his resources through endless litigation. Yet, to Beatlock's vexation, the German immigrant had kept immaculate records, rendering his title unassailable. Worse still, Heinrich had begun selling directly to coal dealers in Cincinnati and Nashville, bypassing Louisville entirely and commanding premium rates for his superlative product. By noviembre de 1855, Cumberland coal faced a mounting crisis. Kellerman's independence was siphoning away profits and emboldening other smallholders to spurn the company's advances. Throughout Kentucky's coal country, whispers grew of an unlettered immigrant who had defied a corporate juggernaut and prevailed. Beatlock's monopoly, years in the making, was beginning to fray. The remedy emerged one frigid December evening when Briggs, after months of reconnaissance, presented what he called a permanent solution to our Kentucky problem. His design was chilling in its simplicity. The Kellermans mined through the brutal winter months, when agriculture lay dormant, entering the tunnels before dawn and laboring until nightfall. In such conditions, an accidental collapse would arouse little suspicion. Whitlock hesitated briefly, sensing the enormity of the suggestion, yet the lure of profit and the peril to his empire proved decisive. The coal fields were worth millions, and in the ruthless arithmetic of Gilded Age capitalism, 5 lives weighed negligible against such returns. On December 10, 1855, Whitlock sanctioned what company ledgers would later euphemize as the Pine Ridge solution. The date was fixed for December 23, when the family would be working deep underground, and winter's severity would hinder any rescue. Briggs arrived in Pine Ridge 3 days prior, taking lodging at the sole boarding house under the guise of surveying railway routes. His presence drew little notice in a town accustomed to transients amid the coal rush. He spent the intervening days finalizing his reconnaissance of the mine, mapping the Kellermans' routines, and selecting the optimal point for his fatal intervention. In his possession were several sticks of dynamite, ostensibly for clearing rail paths, and the tools and expertise to simulate a collapse born of structural frailty. Meanwhile, Heinrich was plagued by a nameless foreboding he could neither dismiss nor define. Martha observed her husband meticulously inspecting and re-inspecting the meanest timbered support beams, murmuring in German about perils that had never previously unsettled him. On the evening of December 21st, Heinrich confided to her that he had been plagued by disquieting visions of the mine collapsing, dreams so hauntingly vivid they carried the weight of omens. Though a pragmatic woman with little tolerance for superstition, Martha urged her husband to heed his instincts. They contemplated a brief respite, perhaps visiting Martha's sister in Nashville until after the new year, yet the Minas winter output was extraordinarily lucrative, its proceeds essential to their ambitions for spring expansion. Heinrich resolved they would labor 2 more days before shuttering operations for Christmas week, a decision, overheard by young Johann at the supper table, that would prove grimly fortuitous for Samuel Briggs, who had wrestled with the timing of his intended sabotage. The boy, brimming with pride in his family's prosperity and eager to impress the children of Pine Ridge, unwittingly revealed their holiday plans while playing in the town square the next morning, a conversation Briggs overheard from across the street. By December 22nd, Briggs had completed his final preparations. Cloaked in darkness, he advanced toward the Kellerman mine, placing explosive charges with surgical precision at key junctures in the main tunnel's support structure. The dynamite was arranged to trigger a sequential collapse, entombing the working chamber beneath an avalanche of stone and rubble, rendering rescue futile and recovery improbable. To the untrained observer, it would seem merely that the Minas' structural integrity had finally surrendered to the oppressive weight of the mountain. The most chilling facet of Briggs' scheme was his exactitude. He had studied mining catastrophes across Appalachia and mastered the art of replicating collapse patterns that appeared purely natural. He even drafted a persuasive geological report for local authorities, arguing that such tragedies were an inevitable consequence of hastily excavated, immigrant-owned enterprises. As the sun dipped below the horizon on December 22, 1855, the Kellerman family assembled for what would unknowingly be their last supper together. Heinrich spoke with pride of the wake's exceptional coal yield, jesting with Martha about the lavish Christmas gifts they could now afford their children. Young Wilhelm prattled excitedly about the new mining cart his father had promised him, while Maria assisted her mother in preparing festive bread from their ancestral recipe. None could fathom that within 12 hours, they would all be dead, victims of America's first corporately orchestrated mass murder, a crime buried in silence for 34 years. December 23, 1855, broke cold and ashen, the wind slicing through the Kentucky highlands with a promise of snow before dusk. As was customary in the profitable winter season, the Kellermans rose before dawn. Martha packed bread, cheese, and coffee while Heinrich inspected his tools beneath the faint glow of lamplight. The children dressed swiftly in the icy cabin, their breath misting in the air as they prepared for another day's toil in the coal seam. From a concealed perch a quarter-mile distant, Briggs peered through field glasses, tracking the family's every motion. His vantage point on a ridge afforded a clear view of both the Minas entrance and the access road, ensuring precise control over the execution of his design. At precisely 6:47 de la mañana, Heinrich lit the first lantern and led his family into the tunnel that would seal their fate. Inside, the Kellermans labored with the practiced synchronicity honed over many long months. Heinrich and Johann concentrated their labor on the most profound recess of the principal shaft, where the coal seam lay in its richest and most readily attainable form. Martha and Maria diligently sorted and heaped the coal into stout wooden carts, while young Wilhelm assisted by ferrying smaller fragments and ensuring the lanterns were positioned with exacting precision. Little Elizabeth played in close proximity, watched with steadfast care by her elder sisters amid the relative warmth of the subterranean chamber. Unbeknownst to the family, Briggs had calibrated his explosive charges to detonate precisely at 10:15 de la mañana, the very moment when they would be deepest within the mine and most distant from any plausible avenue of escape. The timing was paramount, too early, and they might not yet have reached the fatal locus, too late, and they could already be retreating for their midday respite near the portal. For several days, Briggs had meticulously observed their regimen and knew with grim certainty that 10:15 invariably found them in the Minas' most vulnerable position. At 9:30 de la mañana, an unforeseen complication emerged that nearly unraveled his murderous stratagem. Thomas Hartley, a neighboring farmer, approached the Mines entrance to discuss with Heinrich the purchase of coal for his family's winter provisions. Briggs, concealed in his vantage point, watched with mounting unease as Hartley called out and advanced toward the mouth of the tunnel. Should Hartley enter or even tarry nearby, he risked becoming either an unintentional casualty or an inconvenient witness capable of dismantling the fabricated narrative. From his hiding place, Briggs could hear Hartley's voice reverberating into the Mines stony depths. For several tense minutes, it seemed the farmer might venture inside to locate the Kellermans. Briggs, fingers tightened around the pistol in his coat pocket, prepared to silence this unforeseen observer if necessity demanded. Ultimately, Hartley refrained from entering the alien darkness. After several unanswered calls, the Kellermans being too deep within to hear, Hartley left a terse note at the threshold. In reach, Thomas Hartley stopped by at 9:45 de la mañana about winter coal, will return this afternoon. This modest scrap of writing would later serve as pivotal evidence, demonstrating the family's vitality and routine labor less than half an hour before the catastrophic collapse, thereby contradicting subsequent assertions of gradual structural decline. At the appointed second, 10:15 de la mañana, Samuel Briggs depressed the plunger of his improvised detonator, sending a surge of current through copper wires artfully concealed along the forest floor to his strategically embedded charges. The detonation that ensued reverberated for miles, a deep-throated concussion that rattled the panes of Pine Ridge and scattered flocks of startled birds from the surrounding highlands. The cave-in was as ruinous as he had envisaged. The main tunnel imploded along a 200-foot stretch, dislodging thousands of tons of rock to entomb the far chambers where the Kellermans toiled. Sick and dizzy collapses echoed for nearly an hour, eradicating even the faintest hope of rescue. From his concealed perch, Briggs watched the billowing dust with frigid satisfaction. Phase 1 of the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company's Pine Ridge solution was accomplished. Now commenced the subtler endeavor, managing the aftermath and ensuring the truth would be interred as thoroughly as the Kellermans themselves. News of the calamity reached Pine Ridge within hours, carried both by the thunderous report and the towering column of dust above the Kellerman tract. Villagers, led by the guilt-stricken Hartley, whose intended afternoon visit was forestalled by the disaster, rushed to find the entrance sealed beneath colossal boulders and shattered timber. Briggs arrived within half an hour, having circled through the forest to approach from the townward side. His performance as a solicitous surveyor was immaculate, displaying the requisite shock while deftly discouraging rescue efforts that might uncover incriminating traces of sabotage. When Hartley mentioned discovering his note, Briggs was quick to cast doubt, remarking that such slips often drifted away on mountain winds, rendering time estimates unreliable. The ensuing rescue attempt was both valiant and tragic. Men from across Harlan County abandoned their Yuletide preparations to claw at the debris with frostbitten hands, their knuckles raw and bleeding as they labored by torchlight. Reverend Isaac Thornberry led solemn prayers, while the women of Pine Ridge dispensed steaming coffee and bread to the weary diggers. Children stood at a respectful distance, their white eyes absorbing the unspoken truth that some irreparable calamity had befallen the genial German family who always smiled in passing. Hartley, consumed by the thought that his presence that morning might have averted the catastrophe, worked with almost manic fervor. Briggs, ever the manipulator, fanned this remorse, suggesting that amateur miners often disregarded ominous signs that seasoned men would detect. Thus, the psychological sabotage proved as deliberate and cold-blooded as the physical annihilation. Briggs discerned that the corrosive weight of Survivor's guilt would render witnesses more amenable to embracing his account of events. On the second day of the rescue, hope flickered when excavators breached what seemed to be a concealed air pocket within the ruinous debris. Jubilant cries cascaded across the mountainside as men shouted into the yawning void, straining to catch the faintest echo of life from below. For hours, an almost electric optimism coursed through the settlement as the rescuers toiled to enlarge the breach. Yet, when the final barrier was pierced, they uncovered nothing but a hollow cavity, a cruel illusion shaped by the chaotic geometry of fallen stone. No trace of the Kellerman family, no whisper that anyone had endured the first cataclysm. Briggs watched, tension gnawing at him, for the cavity lay perilously close to one of his clandestine explosive placements. He dreaded that further excavation might unmask incriminating shards of dynamite or the unmistakable blast signatures of sabotage. With calculated finesse, he persuaded the rescue leaders that the chamber's fragility rendered continued digging fatally perilous. When dissenters argued for pressing on, Briggs orchestrated a discreet, localized collapse, sealing the aperture in a way that seemed to confirm his cautions regarding structural instability. The emotional devastation among the rescuers was profound. These were not strangers, they had broken bread with Heinrich, watched his children's laughter ripple through their fields. Jon Kellerman had aided many in their modest mining pursuits, freely imparting his father's hard-won technical acumen. Young Maria had taught their daughters lilting German songs. Wilhelm was a beloved companion to the local boys. The thought of these familiar faces entombed beneath the mountain's crushing weight drove the men to the limits of endurance. Dr. Elias Crawford, Heinrich's lone physician, found himself tending not merely to battered flesh but to spirits collapsing under grief's unrelenting strain. Hardened men wept openly as they labored, suffocated by the immensity of loss and their impotence to avert it. In the church, women kept an unbroken vigil, voices rising and falling in hymns Martha Kellerman herself had once taught them. The entire settlement grieved not only the extinguishing of 5 lives but the shattering of innocence, the bitter awakening that their mountain refuge could cradle such calamity. On Christmas Eve, precisely 24 hours after the blast, Reverend Thornberry made the agonizing pronouncement to abandon the rescue. The risk to additional lives had eclipsed all hope, and even the most generous estimations conceded that survival was inconceivable beneath such colossal wreckage for so long. The decree provoked heated disputes, accusations of cowardice mingled with grief. Briggs deftly manipulated the discord, positioning himself as the reluctant bearer of necessary truth. The impromptu memorial held at the Minas Sealed Moor on Christmas morning became one of Heinrich's most searing memories. Nearly every soul in the hamlet gathered in the biting cold, voices mingling in English and German hymns as children laid wildflowers upon the rockfall. Heinrich's mining tools, recovered from the tunnel's mouth, were arranged into a humble shrine. Martha's sewing basket, retrieved from their cabin, brimmed with handwritten tributes to the family's generosity and valor. Briggs stood among the mourners with a mask of solemn sincerity, even contributing to the fund for a formal monument. Weeping, he harbored a dual sense of relief and professional gratification. The operation had unfolded precisely to design, no whisper of foul play detected, public sentiment firmly aligned with the narrative of tragic accident. Yet, the pervasive grief tugged at him unexpectedly, especially when little Sarah Hartley, Thomas' 6-year-old, asked her father why God had taken her friend Wilhelm so near to Christmas. The official inquiry, led by Harlan County Sheriff Marcus Webb, commenced on December 27 with an ostensible rigor. Webb, whose political ascent had been quietly bankrolled by Cumberland Coal and Rail, spent 2 days surveying the collapse site and questioning witnesses. His approach projected methodical thoroughness, intricate diagrams of the debris, meticulously catalogued testimonies. Yet the lines of inquiry Briggs had foreseen remained conspicuously absent. No geological survey to confirm the mountain's instability. No calculation of the improbability that the entire Kellerman family would be in the most treacherous depths at the precise moment of disaster. Most tellingly, no consultation with an explosives expert to scrutinize blast patterns. Briggs supplied what appeared to be authoritative commentary on mining hazards and geological fragility, producing fabricated schematics and spurious surveys from Cumberland's offices that depicted perilous fault lines cleaving through the Kellerman claim. His performance was so persuasive that Webb incorporated verbatim segments into the official report, endowing it with a gravitas it had not earned. The preliminary findings, filed on December 30, 1855, attributed the catastrophe to structural failings endemic to hastily wrought mines lacking engineering oversight or geological appraisal. While couched in tones sympathetic to the deceased, the report effectively absolved all parties while perpetuating pernicious stereotypes about immigrant miners, hard-working yet deficient in technical discernment. Thomas Hartley emerged as the lone persistent skeptic. His note, marked 9:45 de la mañana on the morning of the collapse, attested to the mine's apparent soundness a mere half-hour before the detonation. Hartley further contended that Heinrich Kellerman's expertise had sustained the tunnel for nearly a year without structural mishap. When pressed to reconcile this with the official conclusion, Webb retorted that even seasoned miners could be blindsided by hidden weaknesses. Recognizing the threat Hartley posed, Briggs embarked on a quiet campaign of reputational erosion, suggesting that Arley Survivor's guilt had clouded his reason, inclining him to see conspiracies in shadows. He subtly emphasized Arley's lack of mining credentials, undercutting the weight of his observations with calculated precision. Briggs most emphatically contended that Arley's relentless interrogations impeded the community's capacity to heal and advance beyond their collective calamity. The mounting weight of communal expectation ultimately compelled Hartley to temper the visibility of his inquiries. Though his private convictions remained unshaken, he was certain that a profound falsehood underpinned the official account. Within his personal journal, preserved through successive generations of his family, Hartley recorded, "There was nothing unsound in Inrich's mind that morning. The support stood firm, the air was crystalline, and the tunnel bore no trace of strain. I am no mining engineer, yet I trust the witness of my own eyes. Someone is concealing the truth of what befell that family, and one day, the truth shall surface." The consummate stroke in the orchestration of the concealment arrived in January 1856, when Jeremiah Whitlock himself descended upon Pine Ridge to extend his corporation's condolences and to proffer what appeared to be a magnanimous benefaction to the town. Cumberland Coal and Rail proposed to acquire the Kellerman estate from Harlan County, its reluctant heir due to the family's intestate demise, and endow a substantial sum for a memorial honoring the deceased. Furthermore, the enterprise pledged to provide employment for local men in its expanded mining works, ostensibly ushering prosperity into Pine Ridge in the aftermath of devastation. Beatlock's visit was choreographed as a masterclass in public relations and emotive persuasion. He eschewed the ostentation of a gilded carriage, arriving instead on horseback like a man of the people. Declining the anonymity of a boarding house, he accepted the heartside hospitality of townsfolk, partaking in their modest meals and lending a sympathetic ear to reminiscences of the Kellerman family. His grief seemed sincere, and his assurances of economic renewal offered tangible hope to a settlement burdened by both bereavement and the severity of winter. The proposal was unveiled in the Pine Ridge Church before a near-universal assembly of adult residents. Whitlock spoke with moving eloquence, casting Heinrich Kellerman as an emblem of American enterprise and immigrant resolve. He vowed that Cumberland Coal and Rail would steward the family's discovery with integrity, transforming their sacrifice into a communal inheritance. The memorial fund, he declared, would not merely commission a dignified monument, but also establish a scholarship enabling local children to study mining sciences, thus guarding against future disasters through enlightened technical practice. The fiscal inducements Whitlock advanced were potent enough to dissolve residual suspicion of corporate intent. Pine Ridge, isolated and with meager avenues for secure livelihood, regarded the promise of well-compensated mining labor as an economic turning point. Whitlock was careful to underscore that his company's sophisticated extraction techniques and professional oversight would obviate the hazards that had claimed the Kellermans, recasting tragedy into a catalyst for safety and advancement. Opposition arose chiefly from Thomas Hartley and a handful of townsfolk unsettled by the rapidity and convenience of the arrangement. Hartley warned that embracing the offer so soon after the calamity verged upon profiteering from the dead, urging a year's delay to permit thorough investigation and sober reflection. Reverend Thornberry shared these misgivings, fearing that accelerated commercial expansion might tarnish the memory of the victims. Whitlock rebutted with a blend of pragmatic logic and emotive appeal. The winter's rigors, he noted, and the scarcity of work rendered postponement perilous for struggling families. The most fitting homage to the Kellermans, he argued, lay not in protracted mourning but in ensuring that Discovery's benefits reached the community they had cherished. Most compellingly, he insisted that professional development of the mine would safeguard against further tragedies. After 3 hours of occasionally heated discourse, the vote favored Beatlock's proposal by 47-12. The dissenters, wary of appearing obstructionist against the town's economic hopes, registered their opposition quietly. Hartley was among them, yet he publicly yielded to the collective will, expressing hope that his suspicions would prove unfounded and that some measure of good might indeed emerge from the loss. Within 6 months, Cumberland Coal and Rail had erected a large-scale mining complex upon the Kellerman land, complete with professional engineers, modern safety apparatus, and standardized extraction protocols. Geological surveys, unveiled with much ceremony, confirmed the exceptional richness of the coal seam Heinrich had uncovered, a coincidence that aroused no overt suspicion thanks to Beatlock's meticulous narrative framing. They promised employment materialized in full, local men earned wages that elevated their households, new dwellings rose, children enjoyed improved schooling, and Pine Ridge metamorphosed from an isolated mountain hamlet into a flourishing mining township. The prosperity seemed to vindicate Beetlock's pledges, muting the final murmurs of doubt surrounding the Kellerman affair. Samuel Briggs lingered in the vicinity for several months, ostensibly continuing the railroad survey that had originally served as his pretext. His presence offered a vital thread of continuity and a steadying reassurance as the community navigated its evolving relationship with the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company. He was meticulous in cultivating the image of an impartial authority, one who had guided the townsfolk in comprehending their calamity and charting a constructive course forward. When he had last departed Pine Ridge in the summer of 1856, public gratitude was expressed for his guidance during their hour of crisis. By 1857, the Kellerman family had largely receded from memory, surviving only as a cautionary emblem of the perils inherent in amateur mining and the indispensable role of professional oversight. Their names, etched upon a modest yet dignified stone in Pine Ridge Cemetery, recorded them as victims of an industrial catastrophe. The memorial, funded jointly by the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company and local contributions, bore an inscription that, in retrospect, would acquire a grimly ironic resonance, in memory of the Kellerman family, claimed by the mountain they cherished. Their sacrifice paved the way for progress and prosperity. While this sentiment reflected the Taunton's sincere wish to wrest meaning from tragedy, it equally advanced Cumberland's interests, reinforcing the narrative that their deaths constituted a necessary offering upon the altar of economic advancement. The term sacrifice was particularly insidious, implying a willing consecration rather than a calculated act of elimination, while progress and prosperity reframed their demise as the cornerstone of communal advancement rather than corporate enrichment. For 33 years, this sanctioned version of events persisted, largely unchallenged and unanalyzed. The Kellerman affair devolved into a footnote in Kentucky's mining annals, one among many grim episodes from the perilous dawn of coal extraction in Appalachia. Advocates of mining safety occasionally invoked it as a testament to the necessity of professional supervision, yet none dared question whether the tragedy could have been averted through means beyond superior engineering. Samuel Briggs returned to Louisville, where he was discreetly promoted within Cumberland Coal and Rail, his deft management of the Pine Ridge crisis earning him a reputation as the company's most capable troubleshooter. Over subsequent decades, he deployed comparable strategies to neutralize other impediments to Cumberland's expansion, though none demanded measures as ruthless as those employed against the Kellermans. His methods evolved toward a reliance on legal machinations and financial coercion. The Kellerman episode had demonstrated both the potency and the perils of more direct intervention. Jeremiah Whitlock, meanwhile, ascended to prominence as one of Kentucky's most esteemed industrial magnates, leveraging the profits of the Kellerman coal vein to expand Cumberland into one of the Southwest's preeminent mining enterprises. Hailed as a visionary who brought prosperity to once isolated mountain settlements, Whitlock maintained a public image of scrupulous safety and humane labor conditions, standards upheld through professional engineering and rigorous worker training, and widely regarded as exemplary within the industry. The irony that Beetlock's reputation for benevolence and safety was built upon the foundation of a mass killing remained invisible to all but a select cadre of Cumberland executives who harbored the truth of Pine Ridge. Bound by mutual culpability, shared self-interest, and the knowledge that disclosure would obliterate their careers and jeopardize the livelihoods of thousands dependent on Cumberland's success, they preserved their silence. Yet, as with coal seams themselves, buried truths have an inexorable tendency to force their way to the surface. The concealed reality of the Kellerman murders carried within it the seeds of eventual revelation. That reckoning began in the spring of 1889, 34 years after the killings, set in motion by circumstances even Samuel Briggs could not have foreseen. The catalyst was Briggs himself, 77 years old, wasting away from the pulmonary affliction that had claimed so many who labored amid coal dust. Confined to his bed in Louisville's Charity Hospital, he was attended by Father Michael O'Brien, a Catholic priest ministering to the city's destitute and dying. O'Brien, an Irish immigrant whose own encounters with deprivation and prejudice had sharpened his empathy for the working poor, was regarded as a figure of profound compassion and absolute discretion. He was a trusted confidant for many of Louisvilla's industrial laborers, who often bore unspoken guilt or fear over their employers' morally dubious dealings. What began as a routine administration of the last rites evolved into something extraordinary when Briggs, delirious with fever and crushed beneath the weight of guilt festering for over 3 decades, began to unburden himself of crimes so grave that O'Brien at first dismissed them as the delirium of a dying mind. Yet, with 2 decades of ministry behind him, the priest had learned to distinguish between the fever-born hallucinations of the guilty and the genuine confessions of men confronting eternity. As Briggs continued, the narrative attained such granularity and coherence that dismissing it became untenable. His depiction of the Kellerman estate was rendered with unerring precision, down to the particular timber varieties Heinrich had employed for subterranean supports and the exact schematics of the meanest ventilation apparatus. He recounted conversations with Jeremiah Whitlock verbatim, including those conducted behind locked doors in private offices, where no witnesses had ever been present. Most disquieting was his knowledge of the family's final mourning, details never disclosed to the public, the cadence of their breakfast ritual, the children's exchanges, Marta's meteorological apprehensions, facts that could only have been gleaned through meticulous surveillance preceding their slaughter. Father O'Brien realized he was privy to a confession of unprecedented nature. Briggs delineated the technical underpinnings of his sabotage with the meticulousness of an engineer, explaining his calculations for the optimal placement of explosives to induce a collapse pattern that would appear entirely natural to forensic scrutiny. He elucidated the psychological stratagems employed during the rescue charade, how he weaponized collective grief to stifle rigorous inquiry, and the methodical obliteration of any incriminating traces. The most chilling element was the perverse pride he seemed to take in the architectural finesse of his crime, even while expressing authentic remorse for its human toll. He spoke of the operation as a paragon of orchestration, a flawless homicide that had evaded detection for more than 30 years. Yet his voice trembled with grief when recalling young Wilhelm Kellerman playing in the town square, fully cognizant the boy would perish within days. The juxtaposition of professional satisfaction with visceral guilt had, by Briggs' own admission, plagued him for years, fueling the alcoholism that hastened his physical decline. Bound irrevocably by the inviolable seal of confession yet profoundly unsettled, Father O'Brien confronted an unparalleled moral impasse. The enormity of the atrocity, a calculated eradication of an entire household in the service of corporate gain, demanded retribution even decades later. Yet his sacred obligation forbade direct disclosure. For nights, he wrestled with the irreconcilable tension between his ecclesiastical vows and his ethical outrage. Ultimately, O'Brien devised a course that required adroit navigation of both canon law and personal conscience. While he could not divulge the confession's explicit content, he could initiate a private investigation and orchestrate the discovery of evidence through ostensibly independent channels. This strategy preserved the sanctity of confession while advancing justice, though it necessitated months of scrupulous detective labor. His inquiry commenced with a review of archival materials, newspaper reports of the mine collapse and Sheriff Bibb's official findings. Immediately, anomalies emerged. The sheriff's conclusions leaned heavily upon the technical testimony of Samuel Briggs, yet no record substantiated Briggs' credentials or offered independent corroboration of his geological analyses. Far more damning was the revelation that Webb had received substantial campaign financing from the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company, a glaring conflict of interest that should have precluded his involvement. Records confirmed Cumberland as Bibb's preeminent benefactor, underwriting his electoral victory over a more qualified contender. This financial entanglement, never disclosed during the investigation, cast a long shadow over the integrity of the case. Pursuing the truth, O'Brien sought surviving witnesses to the 1855 calamity, a formidable task given the ravages of time and the community's geographic seclusion. While many had passed or relocated, he ultimately unearthed several elderly residents whose recollections remained crystalline. Juxtaposed with the official account, their testimonies revealed profound inconsistencies, oversights or suppressions by the original inquiry. Most pivotal was his encounter with Thomas Hartley, a 71-year-old living quietly with his daughter in Lexington. Hartley had never relinquished his skepticism toward the official narrative of the Kellerman calamity, meticulously safeguarding an exhaustive archive of his personal observations and apprehensions. Among his private papers were the original notice he had affixed to the mine entrance, granular assessments of the tunnel's structural integrity on the morning of its collapse, and a sequential account of the peculiar incidents that had foreshadowed the disaster. Arley's dossier furnished Father O'Brien with indispensable corroboration for several elements of Briggs' deathbed disclosure. The elderly farmer's records recounted the presence of unfamiliar figures surveilling the Kellerman estate in the weeks preceding the collapse, individuals whose appearance had seemed inconsequential at the time, but whose presence assumed a far more ominous dimension in the light of Briggs' revelations. Harley had further chronicled the relentless economic duress and vexatious legal actions imposed upon the family, pressures which the formal inquiry had summarily dismissed as extraneous to the mining catastrophe. Most consequentially, Harley had safeguarded the original surveyor's evaluations that directly contradicted the estate's geological instability thesis. These assessments, commissioned by E. Heinrich Kellerman himself during the acquisition of the property, attested to the soundness of the rock strata and revealed no trace of the fault lines Briggs later alleged had precipitated the collapse. Although these reports were lodged with the county clerk, they had been conspicuously omitted from Sheriff Bibb's official findings, an omission now appearing less an accident than a calculated suppression. Fortified with this compendium of incriminating evidence, Father O'Brien confronted the delicate task of publicizing the truth without betraying the provenance of his investigation. His stratagem was to enlist Daniel Morrison, a tenacious investigative correspondent for the Louisville Courier-Journal, celebrated for his exposés on corruption within Kentucky's coal industry. Morrison's recent series on hazardous labor conditions and fiscal malfeasance in multiple mining enterprises rendered him an ideal confidant for O'Brien's mission. The priest engineered their meeting to seem fortuitous, positioning himself at a public symposium on mining safety, where he nonchalantly broached his interest in historic mining disasters and mentioned his discovery of compelling archival documents pertaining to the Kellerman affair. When Morrison's professional curiosity was piqued, O'Brien offered access to his research, framing it as an academic inquiry rather than a criminal probe. Morrison's instincts as a journalist were immediately sharpened by the Lacunian contradictions within the official record. Recognizing the contours of a deliberate obfuscation, he commenced an independent investigation, mobilizing his professional networks to interrogate the Cumberland Coal and Rail Company's entanglement in the affair. His inquiry soon transcended the Kellerman episode, uncovering a pervasive pattern of acquiring mineral rights through ethically dubious stratagems. The decisive breakthrough emerged when Morrison unearthed financial ledgers documenting irregular disbursements from Cumberland to Samuel Briggs in late 1855, payments that precisely coincided with the timeline of the Minas destruction. Ostensibly labeled as remuneration for geological consultancy, these sums far exceeded prevailing market rates and were devoid of supporting documentation. Tracing Briggs' later career with Cumberland revealed analogous payments aligned with the company's acquisition of other contested holdings. Morrison also confirmed that Jeremiah Whitlock had made a personal visit to Pine Ridge in the aftermath of the Kellerman tragedy. Contrary to corporate assertions of his non-involvement, townsfolk vividly recalled Whitlock's presence, his conspicuous generosity, and his intimate knowledge of the Minas coal deposits, insights unattainable without prior covert examination. The final fragment of Morrison's evidentiary mosaic emerged unexpectedly: Samuel Briggs' own business ledgers, discovered in a trunk abandoned with his landlady after his demise. These records, documents that Briggs, incapacitated by illness, had evidently been unable to destroy, comprised meticulous cartographic surveys of the Kellerman estate, receipts for explosives purchases, and, most damning of all, a hand-rendered schematic pinpointing the precise loci for engineering a collapse that would appear geologically organic. The schematics contours mirrored, with almost surgical accuracy, the debris distribution ultimately observed at the Kellerman site. Morrison's exposé, serialized in 4 installments in the Louisville Courier-Journal beginning September 15, 1889, detonated through Kentucky's commercial and political spheres like a seismic shock. The inaugural headline declared, "Murder in the Mines, Company Conspiracy Behind Kellerman Family Deaths Exposed After 34 Years." The series dismantled the official accident narrative with methodical ferocity, unmasking an orchestrated regime of intimidation, falsified geological reports, and the pecuniary inducements that had animated the crime. Public outrage surged with an intensity surpassing even Morrison's own prognostications. The Cumberland Coal and Rail Company suddenly found itself besieged, targeted by parallel state and federal criminal inquiries, entangled in civil actions from the bereaved of other mining accidents, and crippled by a consumer boycott radiating across the Ohio Valley. Investors fled in droves, share prices plummeted, lucrative contracts evaporated as clients repudiated association with scandal. Jeremiah Whitlock, then 73 and long enshrined among Kentucky's commercial luminaries, saw his reputation and empire vaporize almost overnight. The titan once lauded as a visionary industrialist and benefactor now stood revealed as the architect of multiple homicides and the profiteer of decades of plundered wealth. His protestations of innocence in the Kellerman affair collapsed beneath the avalanche of documentary proof. Under the corrosive weight of public ignominy and legal peril, his health declined precipitously. Those who encountered him in his final weeks described a man transfigured, prematurely aged, stripped of former self-assurance, gripped by paranoid dread and a morbid fixation on his posthumous image. He squandered endless hours with counsel, contriving legal stratagems to attenuate his criminal exposure, but the evidentiary net was inescapably tight. Merely 3 weeks after Morrison's first article, Whitlock succumbed to a heart attack, an end that startled even his severest detractors. Some ascribed it to coincidence, others contended that the humiliation and psychological strain had, quite literally, extinguished his life. His funeral, once envisioned as a triumphal commemoration of industrial achievement, devolved into a sparsely attended service overshadowed by protesters brandishing placards demanding justice for the Kellermans and other casualties of corporate violence. The legal aftermath of Morrison's revelations was complicated by the attrition of decades and the demise of principal actors. Most conspirators were deceased, vital evidence had been obliterated or dispersed, witnesses were either deceased or scattered beyond reach. Nevertheless, Kentucky authorities filed posthumous criminal charges against Samuel Briggs and initiated exhaustive audits into Cumberland Coal and Rail's corporate conduct since inception. More consequentially, the Kellerman affair crystallized as a rallying banner for labor reformists and mining safety advocates across Appalachia and beyond. It figured prominently in congressional deliberations over mining legislation and armed reformers with compelling precedent for imposing stringent governmental restraints and penal sanctions upon corporate malfeasance. The scandal catalyzed a spate of reinvestigations into other dubious mining disasters throughout Kentucky and neighboring states. Bereaved families, long silenced by official verdicts they distrusted, found new resolve to challenge corporate fictions and demand redress. Several additional instances of corporate-sanctioned violence emerged, though none rivaled the Kellerman case for its audacity and depth of corroboration. The Cumberland Coal and Rail Company itself proved unsalvageable, its legal liabilities and annihilated public trust driving it into bankruptcy within 6 months of the exposé. Its holdings were absorbed by competitors and dismembered, with the Kellerman mine sold to a worker-owned cooperative that operated it until the seam was finally depleted in the early 20th century. The property's eventual fate would have struck Henrich as bitterly ironic yet deeply poetic. The rich vein he had unearthed continued to yield coal for decades, but under collective ownership the profits were equitably distributed among the miners rather than siphoned into corporate coffers. The cooperative instituted safety protocols that far eclipsed industry norms, ensuring no repetition of the Kellerman tragedy, whether through negligence or design. And Thomas hardly lived long enough to witness his protracted quest for justice vindicated at last by Morrison's revelations. The aged farmer, by now lauded as a folk hero for his relentless interrogation of official narratives, spent his twilight years addressing mining communities on the imperative of holding corporations to account for their transgressions. His meticulous chronicle of the Kellerman affair was enshrined in the Kentucky State Archives, ensuring that posterity would inherit a precise testament to the capacity of ordinary citizens to challenge entrenched power through vigilant observation and steadfast devotion to truth. Father Michael O'Brien persisted in his ministry among Louisvilla's laboring poor, yet the Kellerman case left an indelible imprint upon him, profoundly shaping his subsequent crusades for social justice. He never publicly divulged his role in unmasking the murders, preserving the confidentiality of his inquiries until his death decades later. Upon his passing, however, private papers surfaced, revealing his deft navigation of the moral quandaries wrought by Briggs' confession and his inventive strategies for reconciling the pursuit of justice with the sanctity of religious obligations. The repercussions of the Kellerman case reverberated far beyond Kentucky's coalfields. The scandal received exhaustive coverage in newspapers nationwide, evolving into a potent emblem of the moral bankruptcy and excesses of America's Gilded Age capitalism. Labor leaders and social reformers seized upon the case as proof that concentrated corporate might constituted a mortal threat to democratic principles and individual liberties, arguments that would gain increasing currency amid the progressive era reforms of the early 20th century. In 1955, precisely a century after the family's slaughter, the mine was finally depleted and abandoned, its century of production having generated untold millions in wealth. In concert with descendants of pioneers, rich families and labor unions, local historians erected a fitting memorial, not to the casualties of an industrial mishap, but to the Kellerman family, martyred for defying the avarice of corporate power and embodying the promise of economic self-determination that America once held out to its immigrants. Fashioned from the very limestone Heinrich himself had quarried, the monument bears an inscription recounting the family's fate: Heinrich, Martha, Johann, Maria, Wilhelm, and Elisabeth Kellerman, German immigrants who crossed an ocean seeking opportunity, found instead that even in the so-called land of liberty, lives could be deemed disposable when weighed against corporate profit. Murdered December 23, 1855, for refusing to relinquish their aspirations to industrial rapacity. Today, the overgrown mouth of the defunct mine stands as a stark memorial to America's industrial past and the human toll exacted by unfettered capitalism. The site has become a place of pilgrimage for historians, labor advocates, and tourists intent on uncovering the obscured narratives of American economic ascent. Educational initiatives at the memorial illuminate how the Kellerman tragedy mirrored systemic patterns of corporate violence and worker exploitation that shaped the nation's industrial metamorphosis. The Memorial's museum displays artifacts from the investigation that pierced the veil of secrecy surrounding the murders, Morrison's original dispatches, O'Brien's research notes, Thomas Harley's records, and even fragments of Samuel Briggs' operational plans, recovered posthumously. These exhibits reveal not merely what befell the Kellerman family, but also how truth emerged through the courage and tenacity of individuals unwilling to acquiesce to sanctioned falsehoods. Above all, the Kellerman case endures as a sobering parable on the perils of concentrated corporate authority, underscoring the indispensable role of independent journalism, community activism, and moral fortitude in restraining the excesses of power. Its inclusion in Kentucky's school curricula, and beyond, ensures that future generations grasp how common citizens may confront injustice and, against formidable odds, ultimately prevail. The case exemplifies the protracted arc of historical justice, how crimes thought perfectly concealed may be unearthed through the convergence of human conscience, documentary record, and shifting moral sensibilities that render once tolerated conduct intolerable. The 34-year chasm between the atrocity and its exposure attested both to the capacity of corporate influence to suppress truth and to the ultimate futility of entombing moral crimes beneath layers of official dogma and public complicity. The Kellerman case thus exposes a disquieting reality of America's Gilded Age. Beneath the triumphalist tales of industrial progress and economic expansion lay innumerable tragedies, not the work of chance or fate, but of deliberate cruelty by men who prized coal above human life. Yet it likewise affirms the redemptive potency of truth-telling and the possibility that justice, though deferred, may at last prevail when individuals of conscience refuse to allow atrocities to molder beneath the sediment of propaganda and sanctioned deception. So, was justice ever truly served for the Kellerman family? Or does the 34-year delay constitute a damning indictment of American institutions' failure to shield the vulnerable from corporate predation? How many analogous crimes still slumber beneath the official annals of America's industrial rise? Share your reflections on this shadowed chapter of capitalism's history. And if this excavation of buried truth has stirred your interest, subscribe, activate notifications, and pass it along to fellow seekers of historical mysteries that lay bare the uneasy truths of our past.